Britain is resetting its relationship with Europe. Since the 2016 referendum, the topic of Brexit has been one of the most dominant and, let's face it, tense subjects in British politics, and it's a debate that continues to rage to this day. But as Sir Keir Starmer seeks to bring Britain closer to the EU again, it's worth retracing the long and uneasy history of Britain's relationship with Europe, one shaped by war, industry, identity, and eventually Brexit. Welcome to History Counts. If you like to hear the history behind the headlines in the news, please do take a moment to subscribe. We'll start our story in 1945. We could go back further, centuries in fact, but we'd be here all day. If you want to hear more about this stuff, do let me know. At the end of the Second World War, Britain stood battered but victorious. Nazi Germany had been defeated. The streets of London were filled with celebration, but the real story was only just beginning, because whilst the war was over, Europe's future and Britain's place in it was wide open. After the war, Europe was in pieces and Britain, it was flat broke. So the US stepped in with the Marshall Plan, huge loans to help rebuild Western Europe. After the horrors of two world wars, the pinnacle of centuries of conflict between rival powers searching for domination on the continent, the leaders of Europe were desperate to find ways of maintaining the peace. Unity and cooperation were seen as key. The first step came in 1950 with a plan to merge the steel and coal industries of those two great rivals, Germany and France. By 1957, that had evolved, and the signing of the Treaty of Rome marked the start of the European Economic Community, a common market of 6 European nations. Noticeably, however, Britain, one of Europe's great economic powers, was absent, determined to go its own way. By 1973, however, politicians had changed their mind. They faced down a decade of French resistance and took Britain into the common market. But for a united Europe, the train had already left the station, and Britain was always going to be in the awkward carriage, right at the back. For decades, the EEC, which later became the EU, dominated the British economy, pumping money into development and removing barriers to trade. But it also brought regulation, and for many, that meant Brussels calling the shots. It's true that British industry saw some gains, but other places felt left behind. Steel towns, we've talked about them before on this show, fishing ports, communities where decline was blamed on the European Union, even when the story was a little bit more complicated. By the 1990s, the dream of a united Europe was clashing with growing demands for national sovereignty. In Britain in particular, that tension was growing. Margaret Thatcher liked the market but hated losing control. Tony Blair embraced Europe but never joined the euro. By the early 2000s, Europe also meant immigration. Freedom of movement meant that hundreds of thousands of Europeans moved to Britain. Rightly or wrongly, this was hugely unpopular in large parts of the country, where people felt like cheap labour was undercutting wages and putting a huge strain on public services. The tide of Euroscepticism then was rising, driven by political figures like Nigel Farage. By 2016, David Cameron and his Tory government felt compelled to put the question of European membership to the vote. We all know the result: Brexit. A decision decades in the making, and one that's still impacting lives, businesses, and politics to this day. This wasn't just a simple question about policy, it was also about national identity. It was about answering the question of whether Britain is a European nation or one forever apart. I'm still new to YouTube. I try to make videos every week about the history behind the big stories in the news and how we got to where we are today. Any feedback is hugely appreciated. Please do subscribe if you're interested in seeing more videos like the one that you've seen today. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch.